Close your eyes for a second. We are going to do a little time travel, but I have to warn you. I am not taking you anywhere nice. This is definitely not a vacation spot. Not at all. It is November 1854. You are standing in a massive stone building in Scutari, Turkey. It is called the Barrack Hospital. And the first thing that hits you isn't the sight of anything. It is the smell. A physical wall of stench. You are smelling open sewers that are running literally under the floorboards of the building you are standing in. You are smelling gangrene, unwashed bodies, filth. It is just overpowering. And the sound. It is a low, constant hum of suffering. You hear men screaming. And we are not talking about a few dozen men here. No, we are talking about miles of corridors. Miles. Just packed with thousands of soldiers. And here is the data point that really sets the stage. If you are a soldier, lying on one of those floorboards, you are 10 times more likely to die from the air. You are breathing from cholera, typhus, dysentery than from the Russian bullet that actually sent you there in the first place. It is a death trap. It is a petri dish. And then the doors open, and into this absolute hellscape walks a wealthy Victorian aristocrat. She steps out of a carriage. She has got 38 nurses behind her. She is wearing a dress that probably costs more than a soldier makes in a lifetime. The doctors look at her, and they don't see a savior. They see a nuisance. They see an amateur. They see a spy. They see a woman invading a male space, and they are not happy about it. Before we go any further, welcome to History Titans. If you want to uncover the raw truth beneath the myths of history, go ahead and destroy that subscribe button and leave a like. It helps us bring these stories to light. Now let us get back to Scutari. This is where the history books usually give us the soft focus lens. We get the lady with the lamp, the angel smoothing the brow of the dying soldier, which is a beautiful image. It is also a very convenient one. It makes us feel good. It sanitizes the story. But that is not what we are doing today. Today, we are going to smash that lamp. Or at least, we are going to turn up the brightness so high, we can see the cracks in it. Because the story we are covering today isn't about charity. It isn't about being nice. No, it is about the math. It is about supply chains. It is about sewage infrastructure. And it is about a woman who was arguably the first true data scientist in history. We are going to tear down the Victorian saint to find the operator underneath. Because Florence Nightingale was brilliant, yes, but she was also difficult. She was manipulative, and she was relentlessly effective. So welcome to the deep dive. I have got the stack of research here. We are talking biographies, the NIH journals, her own private letters, which are spicy to say the least. She did not mince words at all. And the massive statistical report she wrote herself. Our mission today is to figure out how a woman born into a gilded cage ended up revolutionizing the very concept of healthcare. And why, if you walk into a hospital today and don't die of a staph infection in the lobby, you probably have her to thank. It really is that direct of a link. It is a straight line. But to understand the woman who walked into that hospital in Turkey, we have to start way before the war, because she wasn't born holding a bedpan. She was born into serious money. Serious money. And a very specific kind of intellectual environment. She was born May 12, 1820, in Florence, Italy, hence the name. Very literal parents, extremely. Her older sister was born in Naples, and they named her Parthenope, which was the ancient Greek name for the settlement there. Parthenope. So Florence actually got off easy. If she had been born in a less euphonious city, history might be remembering the lady with the lamp Gertrude. Doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? So the family goes back to England. We need to describe the life she is walking into, because I think we have this generic idea of Victorian wealth, but what does that actually look like for her day to day? It is a life of two houses. Summers at Lea Hurst in Derbyshire. Winters at Embley Park in Hampshire. We are talking servants for everything. We are talking balls, social calls, needlepoint, the whole 9 yards. It was a life designed to do exactly one thing. Manufacture a wife, a high-end wife. The goal was to be decorative pleasant and marry a man with a title or a fortune. But Florence had a problem. Or rather, her parents had a problem. Her father, William Edward Nightingale, W.E.N. as he was called, was a liberal Unitarian. And he had this radical idea that his daughters should actually be educated. dangerous territory for the 1820s. Very. He didn't just teach them to play the piano or speak a little French. No, he taught them Latin, Greek, history, philosophy. But the thing that really stuck, the thing that rewired Florence's brain, was mathematics. And this is the key differentiator, right? Because most girls, even the educated ones, they were not doing calculus. No. It was considered almost unseemly. Math was for men. It was for engineers. It was hard logic. But Florence, she became obsessed. She didn't look at the world and see narratives or emotions first. She saw patterns. She saw structure. She saw data. She was fascinated by tables of data even as a teenager. So she is a teenager. She is brilliant at math. She is living in a mansion. And then, in 1837, she is 17 years old, and something happens that just changes the trajectory completely. She hears a voice. Literally, like a hallucination. She records it in her diary. She says she heard a voice from God calling her to service. Now this is interesting, because usually when people in the 1800s hear voices, they become nuns or mystics. But Florence is a rationalist at heart. She hears the call to serve, but the voice doesn't leave a voicemail with instructions. No specifics. It doesn't say, go be a nurse. It just says, serve. And for years, she is tortured by this. She knows she has a destiny, but she has no vehicle for it. And we need to stress this. Nursing in the 1840s was not a profession. It wasn't something a nice girl did. Absolutely not. It was the bottom of the barrel. The dregs. Nurses were often described as drunken, immoral women. The job was associated with prostitution. It was dirty, uneducated work. You didn't send a Nightingale to empty a chamber pot. Hospitals back then were places where the poor went to die. If you were rich, you had a doctor come to your house. So she is trapped. She has the divine calling. She has the brain of a mathematician, but society is telling her to just sit still and look pretty. And this leads to what she called the despair. For nearly a decade, she is clinically depressed. She feels like she is rotting from the inside out. She wrote that she was starving, in the midst of plenty. There is that famous quote, where she talks about the stagnation of drawing room life. It really paints a picture of how suffocating that privilege could be. She basically said she was dying of boredom. It was a prison. A gilded cage, but a prison nonetheless. And her mother, Fanny, and her sister Parthenope, they were the wardens. They were just desperate for her to marry. They couldn't understand why she wasn't happy. And she had offers. Richard Monckton Milnes. On paper, he was the Bachelor of the Year. He is a politician, a poet, wealthy. He was intellectual. He actually supported women's education. He pursued her for years. It is a perfect match, you would think so. But she turned him down, and her reasoning is fascinating. She wrote that she had an intellectual and passionate nature, and that marriage would require her to sacrifice that for domesticity. She basically said, I cannot nail my brain to the kitchen table. Wow, what a line. She knew that if she married him, she would spend the rest of her life planning dinner parties, and that would literally kill her soul. That takes incredible strength of character, to say no to the easy approved path, because you know it is wrong for you. Especially when everyone you know is telling you are crazy. It took her until she was 31 years old to finally break out. 31. That is ancient in Victorian marriage. She was an old maid, a spinster. But that status ironically actually gave her a little bit of leverage. In 1851, she finally convinces her parents to let her go to Kaiserswerth in Germany. Kaiserswerth was a religious institution, a Lutheran one. So she frames it as a religious pilgrimage. Smart, very smart. I am going to get closer to God. But when she gets there, she isn't just praying. She is studying the systems. She wants to know how the laundry is cycled, how the food is distributed. She observes the discipline, and she goes to Paris later and studies with the Sisters of Mercy. She is effectively doing an MBA in hospital administration. She is building the toolkit. She isn't just learning how to bandage a wound. She is learning how to run an organization. So in 1853, she comes back to London and gets her first real job. Superintendent of the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen on Harley Street. Gentlewomen. It sounds very delicate. It was a small establishment. for governesses and ladies of reduced means who got sick. But it was a laboratory for her. She reorganized the place. She saved money. She installed dumbwaiters' little lifts to bring hot food up to the floors so the nurses didn't have to carry heavy trays. Efficiency. She was obsessed with it. And here's a detail that explains everything that comes later. Her father, W.E.N., he finally accepts her path, and he gives her an allowance. £500 a year. In today's purchasing power, that is somewhere around 60,000, maybe 70,000 pounds a year. Tax-free, essentially. So that changes the dynamic completely. She isn't an employee working for a paycheck. No. She is a volunteer with a trust fund. Precisely. She had go-away money. She could walk away at any time, which meant she could dictate terms. She didn't have to bow to the hospital board. If they annoyed her, she could just threaten to leave. That financial independence is the engine that powered her entire career. So she is in London. She is running the small hospital. She is seeing the cholera outbreaks. She is starting to connect the dots between filth and death. And then, 1854 hits. The Crimean War. This is the crucible. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire declare war on Russia. Now, usually, when Britain went to war, the public heard about it weeks later. It was romanticized. The glory of the empire, the charge of the Light Brigade, all that. But this was the first media war. The Telegraph existed, and the Times, the biggest newspaper in London, had a correspondent, on the ground William Howard Russell, and he wasn't sending back poems. He was sending back horror stories. He was reporting that the British Army was just falling apart. He reported that the French had nuns' ambulances and organized care. The British had nothing. Nothing. Men were rotting on the beach. They were being transported in ships that were basically floating coffins. The public in England went insane. They were furious. They demanded the government do something. And the Secretary of War happens to be Sidney Herbert, who was a close personal friend of Florence Nightingale. They had met years earlier in Rome. He knew she was interested in hospital reform. It is all about who you know. He writes to her. She writes to him, and they agree. She will lead a team of nurses to Scutari. It was an experiment. Women had never been part of the British Army official structure before. It was completely unprecedented. So she packs up 38 nurses, November 1854. She arrives at the Barrack Hospital, and we are back to that scene we started with. The smell, the chaos. Let us deepen that picture a little. The Barrack Hospital was built on a slope. The sewers were defective, so the waste backed up into the building. Oh God. The water supply was contaminated with dead animals. The floorboards were rotten and crawling with vermin. And the doctors. I imagine they were not rolling out the red carpet for Miss Nightingale. They hated her. You have to understand the military hierarchy. It is a boys' club. And suddenly, here is this high society woman with a letter from the Secretary of War telling seasoned surgeons how to run their hospital. They saw her as a threat. They viewed her as a spy. They blocked her from the wards. They basically said, sit in your corner and don't touch anything. So what did she do? Did she storm in and start shouting orders? Did she pull rank? No. And this is where we see her genius. She didn't fight them on medicine. She knew that would get her kicked out immediately. She fought them on logistics. She saw that the men didn't have shirts. They didn't have plates. They were eating with their bare hands. Basic human dignity stuff. So she used her own money and money raised by the Times to buy shirts, to buy vegetables, to fix the kitchen, to buy scrubbing brushes. A ton of scrubbing brushes. She made herself indispensable before she made herself medical. She played the long game. She waited for the system to break, and it did. The Battle of Inkerman brought in a flood of casualties that the doctors physically couldn't handle. The system just collapsed, and they had no choice. They looked at Nightingale and her team and said, fine, help us. And she was ready, but she didn't start with surgery. She started with cleaning, literally. She bought 200 scrubbing brushes. She organized the nurses to scrub the floors. She set up a laundry. Think about that. Thousands of men with dysentery bleeding wounds. And no one had washed the sheets in months. It is horrifying. She broke the chain of infection even if she didn't fully understand the germ theory behind it yet. She was operating on the miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease. She believed that foul odors were the disease itself. Scientifically, she was wrong, but practically, the solution for bad smells is ventilation and cleaning. So she accidentally did exactly the right thing for the wrong reason. She got the right answer with the wrong formula. Now, while she is scrubbing, she is doing something else. Something that goes back to those math lessons with her father. She is counting. She is recording everything, every single admission, every discharge, every death, and crucially, the cause of death. She realized the Army's records were a complete mess. One department called a disease one thing. Another department called it something else. There was no consistency, so she standardized the data, and the numbers she was seeing were terrifying. In the winter of 1854, the mortality rate at Scutari was over 40%. Stop and think about that. You go to the hospital, and it is pretty much a coin flip whether you come out alive. It was catastrophic. You were safer in the trenches. But then something happens. The Sanitary Commission arrives from London, largely because Nightingale and others were screaming for help. They flushed the sewers. They cleaned the ventilation shafts. They removed the rotting horse carcasses from the water supply. They basically did basic plumbing. And the data drops like a stone. Within 6 months, the mortality rate goes from over 40% to 2%. 2%. That is the proof. That is the smoking gun. But here is the tragedy, and this is the part that haunts her later. Nightingale didn't realize why it dropped at the time. She thought it was her nursing. She thought it was the food and the kindness and the clean sheets. It wasn't until she got back to England and crunched the numbers that she realized the horrifying truth. That for the first 6 months before the sewers were fixed, she had likely been presiding over a death camp. That the men might have been safer if they hadn't come to the hospital at all. That all her scrubbing didn't matter if the water they were drinking was poison. So she comes home a national hero, but inside she feels like a murderer. She feels immense guilt. She calls it the blood on my hands. She realized that mere care, the smoothing of brows, the lamp wasn't enough. The infrastructure was killing them. And that realization turns her from a nurse into a statistician. Let us talk about the lady with the lamp image briefly before we get to the data visualization. Because it was a real thing. It wasn't just made up by the newspaper. She worked 20 hours a day. When the other nurses went to sleep, she walked the wards, miles and miles of corridors. She carried a Turkish paper lantern, the concertina style usually. And for these soldiers, seeing her was spiritual. They kissed her shadow as it passed. Why did it matter so much to them? Because before her, nobody cared. The British soldier was considered scum of the earth by the aristocracy. Wellington literally called them that. So to have a high-born lady kneeling beside them, writing letters home for them, treating them like human beings, it broke every class barrier in the book. It gave them dignity. And it was PR gold. It was the ultimate propaganda image. It softened her. It made her safe. A woman with a lamp is an angel. A woman with a statistical report and a demand for sewer reform is a threat. Now we need to pause here and bring in another figure, because you cannot tell the full story of Crimea without talking about Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole. She was a Jamaican-Scottish woman. She was a doctoress, an experienced healer, who had dealt with cholera and yellow fever in Panama and Jamaica. And she was in London when the war started. She wanted to help. She applied to the War Office. Rejected. She applied to the medical department. Rejected. And then she went to Florence Nightingale's recruiting office to ask to join the team. Rejected. Why? Well, Nightingale had very rigid standards. She wanted women of a certain class, a certain demeanor, women she could control. But it is impossible to ignore the racial prejudice of the time. Seacole was a woman of color. She was boisterous. She was unconventional. She didn't fit the Victorian mold of the quiet sister. But Seacole didn't give up. Number. And I love this about her. She basically said, "Fine, I will do it myself." She used her own money to sail to Crimea. She set up the British Hotel. Which wasn't really a hotel, right? No, it was more like a canteen, a store, and a clinic. And here's the thing. She was actually closer to the fighting than Nightingale was. She would ride out to the battlefields with wine and bandages. So she was comforting men while the cannons were still firing. While Nightingale is back at the base hospital fixing the administration, Seacole is on the front lines. It is so often framed as a rivalry. History often tries to pit them against each other, the sane versus the outsider. But it is important to see them as two different kinds of heroes. Seacole was the hands-on healer, the mother figure who was there in the dirt. Nightingale was the administrator, the system builder. And you need both. You absolutely need both. But Nightingale's legacy is the system that outlasted her. So the war ends in 1856. Nightingale comes home. She is the most famous woman in the empire, second only to Queen Victoria. And she goes into hiding. She travels under the name Miss Smith. She enters her house by the back door. She refuses the parades, the celebrations. Why? Most people would take the victory lap because of that guilt we talked about. She is haunted by the 4,000 men who died in her hospital before the reforms. She doesn't want applause. She wants reform. She wants to make sure it never happens again. And this begins the strangest and maybe most controversial phase of her life, the invalid phase. The invalid in the empire. Shortly after returning, she collapses. She spends the next several decades mostly confined to her rooms, often in bed. What was wrong with her? What was the diagnosis? It was likely Crimean fever, which we now believe was brucellosis. It is a bacterial infection you can get from unpasteurized milk or meat. It causes chronic pain, fatigue, depression, spinal pain. It is a miserable, debilitating disease. But there is a theory that she used this illness, strategic invalidism theory, and it is compelling. Think about her life before the war. That gilded cage, the social obligations, the dinner parties, the stuff she hated, she despised it. Being sick gave her the ultimate excuse. I'm sorry I cannot come to tea, I am dying. It freed her from all of that. She wasn't too sick to work. Never. She worked harder than anyone in government. She turned her bedroom into a command center. She controlled access. If you wanted to see Florence Nightingale, you had to make an appointment, so cabinet ministers had to come to her bedroom and stand by her bed. It completely leveled the playing field. That is incredibly manipulative and also completely genius. She used the weakness of her body to project the strength of her mind. She hacked the patriarchy. A healthy woman has social duties she must attend to. A sick woman is left alone to think. And what was she thinking about? She was thinking about how to prove to the government that they had killed those men with their negligence. She needed to convince the politicians to change the army's entire medical system. But she knew that politicians are lazy. Some things never change. They do not read 800-page reports filled with tables of numbers. So she decided she needed to draw them a picture. She invented the coxcomb, the polar area diagram. Explain this to us because this is a huge moment in the history of data visualization. Imagine a pie chart. But in a normal pie chart, the wedges are different widths to show a percentage. In her chart, the wedges are all the same width. Each one represents a month, but they extend outward from the center, like flower petals. So the size of the petal shows the number. The further out the petal goes, the more deaths occurred in that month. And then she color-coded it. Blue for preventable disease. Red for wounds. And what you see, what you cannot not see, is that the blue wedges were massive. They looked like giant explosions coming out of the center, dwarfing the tiny little red slivers from combat. It was a visual slap in the face. You look at that chart, and you instantly understand we are killing our own men with filth. It was maybe the first time data visualization was used for social activism. She printed it. She sent it to the Queen. She sent it to members of Parliament. She forced them to look at it. She essentially said, look at this blue shape. That is your incompetence made visible. And it worked. It absolutely worked. It sparked the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army. It led to the rebuilding of barracks. She proved that soldiers in peacetime barracks in England were dying at double the rate of civilians because of overcrowding and bad air, all from her bed. She saved thousands of lives without ever leaving her room. She was the first woman elected to the Royal Statistical Society because of this work. In 1858, she wasn't just a nurse. She was a pioneer of applied statistics. She showed that statistics weren't just abstract numbers. They were a tool that could save lives. But her reach went even further than the British Army. She started reorganizing India from her bedroom in London. It is incredible. She had never been to India, but she got her hands on all the data from the colonial stations. She saw the same patterns: filth, bad water, poor drainage. The same story, different continent. She became a robust advocate for sanitation reform in India, working with doctors and administrators there. Now we have to address the complexity here, because she is doing this as a function of the British Empire. Yes, that is the crucial context. Her goal was to keep the British troops healthy so they could maintain control of India. It was at its core a colonialist project. She wasn't trying to free India. She was trying to make the occupation more efficient. She viewed the Indian population somewhat paternally as people who needed to be civilized with British hygiene. It is that nuance we promised. She isn't a modern social justice warrior. She is an operator within the Victorian imperial system. Exactly. But her reforms, irrigation, drainage, clean water, undoubtedly improved public health for millions of Indian citizens too. The effects were broader than the intent, you could say. She helped set up the sanitary administration of modern India. Which brings us to 1860, the thing she is most famous for, the Nightingale Training School. This is the moment nursing becomes a real profession. Before this, you learned by watching, or you were just a servant who happened to be in a hospital. After this, you learned by studying. She established a curriculum at St. Thomas's Hospital, a rigorous one. Hygiene, anatomy, discipline, moral character. She wanted nurses to be respectable. That was key. She was fighting that old image of the drunken nurse. She made them wear uniforms. She vetted them carefully. She was turning nursing into a secular vocation, a respectable career for women. And she wrote the textbook for it. Notes on Nursing, a huge bestseller. And the advice in it is shockingly modern. Diet, dirt, and drains. That is the core. But she also focused on the patient's mental state. She hated dark curtains. She hated unnecessary noise. There is that funny bit about crinoline skirts. She told nurses not to wear them, those big hoop skirts, because they made noise and knocked things over. She said a nurse should move quietly and efficiently. But my favorite line, especially now post-2020, is about hands. Every nurse ought to be careful to wash her hands very frequently during the day. Hand washing in 1859. Decades ahead of the curve on hygiene. She also understood the architecture of health. She championed the pavilion-style hospital. It is a design with long wards, big windows on both sides for cross-ventilation, high ceilings. She believed the building itself was a medical instrument. If you walk into an old hospital building today, high ceilings, lots of light, that is Florence Nightingale's brain, made out of brick and mortar. She lived a long time. She lived to be 90. She outlived almost all her friends, all her contemporaries. She outlived Sidney Herbert, her great ally, by decades. She worked almost to the end. But as she got older, she became more reflective. She eventually accepted the Order of Merit in 1907. She was the first woman to ever receive it, but she was practically blind by then. When she died in 1910, she could have had a state funeral. Westminster Abbey. The whole works. She deserved it. She was a national icon by that point. But she refused it. She left instructions for a similar burial in a small churchyard at St. Margaret's, East Wellow. And her tombstone. It doesn't say Savior of the Crimea or Founder of Nursing. It just says F.N. Born 1820. Died 1910. Just the initials. That is a flex. She let the work speak for itself. So we have smashed the lamp. We have looked at the data. We have seen the good, the bad, and the colonial. What is the takeaway? Because she is a complicated figure. She wasn't a feminist in the modern sense. She actually thought the vote was secondary to the work. She wrote that there are evils which press much more heavily on women than the want of the suffrage. She was a pragmatist. She didn't care about rights as much as she cared about results. So what is the lesson for us? What does she represent? I think she proves that compassion without competence is just a nice feeling. It doesn't actually save lives. To save lives, you need the heart, yes, but you also need the head. You need the math. You need the political will to flush the sewers. And you need to be willing to be difficult. You have to be willing to be difficult. She was the passionate statistician. And I think that is her real legacy. Every time a nurse checks a patient's chart, every time a hospital administrator looks at infection rates, every time we use data to solve a public health crisis, that is the ghost of Florence Nightingale still working in her bedroom. It is a powerful legacy. And a reminder that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is sit down, shut up, and run the numbers. Amen to that. And a final thought. If Florence Nightingale were alive today, with access to big data and what would she be doing? She wouldn't be changing bedpans, that is for sure. No way. She would be running the World Health Organization or the CDC. She would be analyzing global pandemic data. She would be the CEO of a global health organization. She would be running the world, no doubt in my mind. That is it for this deep dive into the complete life of Florence Nightingale. We hope you look at the next pie chart you see with a little more respect. It might just save your life. If you want to uncover more stories of the titans who built our modern world, make sure you subscribe to the History Titans channel. Like this audio and share it with a friend who loves history. It really helps us keep the lights on and the archives open. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next one.